The John Deere dealership in Millbrook had glass windows so clean you could see your reflection from across the street, and inside, everything gleamed under fluorescent lights, new tractors lined up like soldiers, paint so fresh it still smelled chemical, price tags that made most farmers look away. But on a cold March morning in 2019, a man named Tom Whitaker walked through those doors wearing boots caked in real mud, not the kind you get from a Sunday drive past a field, and the salesman's smile tightened just a fraction. Tom was 58, with hands that told decades of stories in calluses and scars, the kind of quiet man who listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight because they'd been measured first. He'd driven in from his 200-acre farm in his '98 Ford, the truck's bed still loaded with fence posts in a toolbox that had been his father's, and he wasn't there to browse. His John Deere 7820, just 4 years old and still gleaming green, had thrown a rod 2 days prior, catastrophic engine failure that made the service tech whistle low and shake his head like a doctor delivering bad news. The dealership's service manager, a man named Derek Paulson who wore a company polo tucked tight and spoke in the confident tone of someone who'd never actually farmed a day in his life, quoted Tom the repair cost, $22,000. Tom didn't flinch, didn't argue, just nodded slowly and asked how long it would take. 3 weeks, maybe 4, Derek said. Parts have to come in, you know how it is, and besides, with a tractor that new, you're probably better off trading up. We've got financing options that'll make it easy. There was something in the way Derek said easy that made Tom's jaw tighten just slightly. The assumption that a farmer in dirty boots couldn't do math, couldn't see that easy payments meant paying twice what something was worth over years of interest. Tom thanked him quietly, shook his hand with a grip that made Derek wince, and walked back out to his truck. He didn't drive home angry. Tom Whitaker didn't waste energy on anger, but he drove home thinking. And by the time he pulled into his gravel driveway, past the white farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1947, past the barn that leaned just slightly to the east from 60 years of weather, past the machine shed where his old Farmall M sat covered in dust and memory, he'd made a decision that would make Derek Paulson and half of Millbrook question everything they thought they knew about farming, progress, and what happens when you underestimate a quiet man who knows exactly what he's doing. The Farmall M had been sitting in that machine shed since 2003, the year Tom's father passed, and left him the farm along with every piece of equipment they'd ever owned, including that 1952 tractor that had plowed every inch of this land for half a century. Most farmers would have scrapped it or sold it to some collector who'd restore it for show, park it at antique tractor pulls where old men could admire the paint and reminisce. But Tom had kept it covered and dry for reasons he couldn't quite explain. Maybe sentiment, maybe stubbornness, maybe some deeper instinct that waste was a sin and good iron never really dies. The tractor wasn't pretty. The red paint had faded to a dusty coral in spots. The seat was cracked leather that had molded itself to his father's shape over thousands of hours. The controls were simple to the point of brutal. But when Tom pulled the tarp off that evening, running his hand along the engine block, he felt something the John Deere had never given him: familiarity. He spent that first night in the shed with a work light strung up, going through the Farmall engine piece by piece, cleaning decades of settled dust from the valve covers, checking the compression, draining old fuel that had turned to varnish. And what he found surprised him. The engine was solid. His father had maintained it like scripture. Every oil change documented in a notebook that still sat in the toolbox. Every part that needed replacing had been replaced with quality, not convenience. And after 16 years of sitting, the thing turned over on the third try, coughing blue smoke and rattling like a jar of bolts before settling into a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Tom's wife, Linda, came out to the shed around 10 that night with coffee and the kind of look that meant she knew he was up to something. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" she asked, and Tom just smiled that quiet smile that had made her fall in love with him 40 years ago, the one that meant, "Yes, but I'm not explaining until I'm sure." Over the next week, Tom did something that made the local mechanic, a man named Pete who'd worked on farm equipment since the '70s, actually laugh out loud when he heard about it. Tom was going to pull the engine from his 4-year-old $70,000 John Deere 7820 and replace it with the engine from a 1952 Farmall M that was probably worth $3,000 if you found the right buyer at an auction. Pete stopped laughing when Tom showed him the measurements, the modifications he'd already planned, the adapter plates he'd sketched out on graph paper with the precision of an engineer, because Tom Whitaker might have been a farmer, but he'd also spent 2 years in technical school before coming back to the land, and he understood torque, horsepower, gear ratios, and stress loads better than most men who'd never touched dirt. "It'll work," Tom said simply, and Pete, looking at those sketches, had to admit the crazy bastard might be right. Word travels fast in a farming community, faster than it should considering most people live miles apart, but somehow by the time Tom had the John Deere's hood off and the modern engine exposed like surgery, half the county knew what he was doing. The first person to show up uninvited was Derek Paulson from the dealership, driving out in a company truck that had never seen a dirt road it didn't try to avoid, his face tight with something between concern and offense. "Tom, I heard what you're planning," Derek said, stepping carefully around a puddle like it might stain his shoes. "And I've got to tell you, man to man, this is a mistake. You can't just swap engines like that, especially not with something from the 50s. You're going to void every warranty, risk the whole tractor, and even if it runs, which I doubt, you'll have no support, no parts network, nothing. Let me work with you on financing. We can get you into something newer, something reliable." Tom didn't stop working, didn't even look up from where he was unbolting the engine mounts, just said quietly, "This Farmall engine ran for 51 years without a major failure. Your engine lasted 4. I'll take my chances." The silence that followed was the kind that makes a point sharper than any argument, and Derek left without another word, his truck kicking up gravel a little too fast on the way out. But Derek wasn't done. He couldn't be, because if Tom Whitaker succeeded, if this ridiculous project actually worked, it would raise questions Derek didn't want anyone asking. Questions about planned obsolescence, about why modern equipment cost 6 times more but lasted half as long, about whether all this computerized technology was really serving farmers or just serving dealerships. So Derek did what men do when they're scared of being wrong. He talked. At the feed store, at the diner, at the co-op, he mentioned Tom's project with a knowing smile, called it that crazy thing Whitaker's doing, suggested it was desperation, maybe even early dementia, and enough people listened because Derek wore clean shirts and spoke with authority, the kind of authority that comes from selling expensive things to people who need them. Tom heard about it, of course. Linda told him one evening after church, where 3 different people had asked if he was doing okay, with that concerned tone that really meant, "We heard you've lost it." But he didn't defend himself, didn't explain, just kept working. By mid-April, he had the John Deere engine completely removed, sitting on a pallet in the corner of the shed like some artifact from a future that had already failed, all plastic cowlings and electronic sensors and computer modules that couldn't be repaired, only replaced at prices that made strong men wince. The Farmall engine sat next to it, smaller, simpler, every part visible and understandable. No secrets, no codes, just iron and steel and combustion, doing what it had done since the Industrial Revolution.
Tom spent 3 days machining the adapter plate in Pete's shop, working metal until it fit perfectly, checking tolerances with calipers. And when he finally lowered that old engine into the new tractor's frame, it settled in like it had been waiting 70 years for this exact moment. The actual installation took 2 weeks of 12-hour days, Tom working with the methodical patience of a man who'd learned long ago that rushing breaks things and fixing mistakes takes longer than doing it right the first time. He fabricated custom motor mounts from 1/4-inch steel plate, welded and ground smooth until they held that Farmall engine steady as a rock. The transmission adapter was the hardest part. Matching a 1952 power takeoff system to a 2015 hydraulic transmission required precision that made Pete shake his head in respect more than once. But Tom had measured everything 3 times, calculated the gear ratios on paper that got oil-stained and coffee-ringed but never wrong. And when he finally connected the drive shaft with a universal joint he'd modified himself, it lined up within 0.02 of an inch. The electrical system was simpler than anyone expected. The Farmall ran on 6 volts and magneto ignition, didn't need computers or sensors or any of the complicated emissions equipment that had made the John Deere engine so expensive and fragile. So Tom just bypassed all of it, ran direct wiring for the basics, and suddenly had a tractor that could be fixed with a screwdriver and a wrench instead of a laptop and a dealership technician. By early May, with planting season already 2 weeks behind schedule and his fields still waiting, Tom was ready to fire it up. Linda came out to watch, and so did Pete, and Tom's neighbor Carl, who'd been farming the next section over for 40 years and had seen enough crazy ideas fail to be skeptical but hopeful. Tom climbed into that John Deere cab, the modern seat and air conditioning and GPS display all still there, looking strange above an engine that had been designed when Eisenhower was president, and he turned the key. The Farmall engine coughed once, twice, then caught with a sound nothing like the smooth diesel purr the John Deere had made. This was rougher, louder, a mechanical rhythm you could feel in your chest, the sound of controlled explosions happening in cylinders machined before computers existed. It rattled the cab, shook the whole frame, and for a moment everyone watching held their breath thinking it would shake itself apart. But then it settled, found its pace, and ran steady as a drumbeat. Tom let it idle for 10 minutes, watching the temperature gauge he'd rigged to an old mechanical sensor, listening for any knock or ping that would mean failure. But the engine just ran, burning fuel and making power like it had never stopped, like the 67 years between its birth and this moment were nothing but a long rest. He engaged the transmission carefully, felt it catch and hold, then drove that Frankenstein tractor out of the shed and into the yard, the old engine pulling the new hydraulics without complaint, the whole impossible machine working exactly as he'd known it would. Carl started laughing, not mocking but amazed, the kind of laugh that means you've just seen something you didn't think was possible, and Pete just stood there grinning and shaking his head, muttering "I'll be damned" over and over. Linda kissed Tom on the cheek when he climbed down, didn't say anything, didn't need to, just smiled with the pride of a woman who'd never doubted her husband even when everyone else had. Tom took the tractor to the field the next morning, hitched up his 12-row planter that the John Deere had pulled for 4 seasons, and started planting corn while half the county waited to hear that it had broken down, caught fire, or proved Derek Paulson right in some spectacular failure. But it didn't fail. The Farmall engine pulled that planter through 200 acres of spring soil, some of it heavy clay that bogged down lesser machines, and it never hesitated, never overheated, never stuttered. The fuel consumption shocked Tom in a way he hadn't expected. The old engine burned through diesel slower than the modern one had, running leaner and simpler without all the emissions equipment and computer controls that were supposed to make things efficient, but somehow never did. By the end of the first week, Tom had planted his entire corn acreage and started on soybeans, and the tractor was still running like it had just rolled off the factory floor, or rather, like it had rolled off the factory floor in 1952 and didn't understand the concept of planned obsolescence. Word got around differently now, not Derek's dismissive gossip, but farmer-to-farmer truth, the kind that spreads through nods at the co-op and short conversations over fence lines. Men started showing up at Tom's farm, not to mock, but to see, standing in respectful silence while that hybrid machine worked the fields, the modern cab and the ancient engine somehow making more sense together than either had alone. One of them was a younger farmer named Jake Morrison, maybe 35, who'd taken over his family's operation 5 years back and was already drowning in equipment debt, payments on tractors and combines that cost more than his house and broke down with the kind of frequency that made him wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake choosing this life. Jake watched Tom work for a whole afternoon, didn't say much, just observed, and when Tom finally shut down and climbed out, Jake asked the question that was really bothering him. "How much did this conversion cost you?" Tom wiped his hands on a rag, thought about it, then said, "About $4,000 in parts and materials, 2 weeks of my time. Whole thing cost less than 1 payment on a new tractor would have been." Jake went quiet, doing math in his head that was probably adding up to something painful, and Tom could see it in his face, the realization that he'd been sold a story about progress that was really just a story about profit. Derek Paulson showed up again in mid-May, but this time he wasn't alone. He brought the regional service manager from John Deere,
a man in a company jacket who introduced himself as Mr. Patterson and spoke with the careful politeness of someone delivering legal concerns. They stood in Tom's yard while the tractor sat nearby, engine ticking as it cooled, and Mr. Patterson explained that what Tom had done violated several regulations, possibly voided certifications, definitely voided warranties, and could present liability issues if something went wrong. Tom listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when Mr. Patterson finished, Tom said simply, "It's my tractor. I paid for it. I can modify it however I want." Mr. Patterson's smile got tighter. "Mr. Whitaker, we understand your frustration with the repair costs, but modern engines are complex for good reasons: emissions standards, fuel efficiency, reliability. What you've done here is put an antique engine into a modern machine, and while I'm sure it runs now, it's only a matter of time before something fails catastrophically." Tom looked at the man, then at Derek, who was standing slightly behind, like he was hiding behind authority, and said something that would get quoted around Millbrook for years. "My father ran that engine for 51 years. Your company's engine lasted 4. Tell me again which one's unreliable." The silence that followed was the kind that settles heavy, the kind where everyone present knows something true has just been said, and no amount of corporate talking points can unsay it. Mr. Patterson's face went through several expressions: surprise, offense, calculation, before settling on professional dismissal. "Well, Mr. Whitaker, you're certainly entitled to your opinion, but I'd strongly advise you to consider the safety implications and potential consequences." Tom just nodded, the conversation clearly over in his mind, and the two men from John Deere left with the uncomfortable energy of people who'd expected to intimidate someone and found themselves facing a wall they couldn't climb. Derek didn't come back after that, but the story did, spreading beyond Millbrook into neighboring counties, showing up on farming forums and Facebook groups where people posted pictures they'd taken of Tom's tractor at the co-op, the sleek modern green body with that unmistakable sound of vintage iron underneath. Some comments were supportive, celebrating a farmer who'd beaten the system, but others were dismissive, calling it redneck engineering or a publicity stunt, and a few were genuinely concerned, worried that Tom was risking his safety or setting a bad example. Tom didn't read any of it. He didn't have Facebook and barely used the internet except to check grain prices, but Linda did, and she'd tell him the interesting parts over dinner. The debates between farmers who thought he was a hero and dealership guys who thought he was dangerous. What changed everything was harvest. By September, Tom had put over 800 hours on that engine, running it through planting, spraying, cultivating, and finally combining, using it for every job his farm required, and it hadn't failed once. He'd changed the oil twice, replaced one fuel filter, adjusted the timing once, and that was it. Maintenance that cost him maybe $60 in 2 hours of work, the kind of simplicity that seemed impossible in an era where tractors needed software updates and diagnostic computers just to change a sensor. Other farmers noticed, especially the ones struggling with equipment that spent more time in the repair shop than the field, and a few started asking Tom if he'd help them do similar conversions. He always said no, not because he didn't want to help, but because he understood that what he'd done required knowledge most people didn't have, precision most shops couldn't guarantee, and a willingness to accept responsibility that came easier to men who'd grown up fixing everything themselves. But he did start sharing his measurements, his sketches, his parts sources, posting them in a folder at the feed store where anyone could look, and that felt right. Not doing the work for people, but giving them the information to do it themselves if they had the skill and the courage. By October, something unexpected happened that Tom hadn't anticipated. Collectors started calling, offering him money for the tractor, serious money, $20,000 or $30,000 for what they saw as a unique piece of agricultural history. Tom turned them all down, politely but firmly, because this wasn't art or history or some museum piece. It was a working tractor that he needed, and more than that, it had become a statement he hadn't meant to make but couldn't unmake now. It proved something that corporate agriculture didn't want proven, that simpler could be better, that older could be more reliable, that the story of constant upgrades and planned obsolescence was exactly that, a story, one written by people selling expensive solutions to problems they'd created. Derek Paulson eventually left the dealership, took a job selling RVs 3 counties over, and nobody missed him much. The John Deere company never acknowledged Tom's tractor officially, never commented on the growing number of farmers discussing engine swaps and right-to-repair legislation. But in service centers and dealership back rooms, technicians and managers started hearing a question they hadn't before. If that old Farmall engine can run 800 hours without a problem, why can't your new ones? The following spring, Tom Whitaker planted his field same as always, the hybrid tractor running its second season without major incident, the Farmall engine now past 1,500 hours and still going strong, still sounding like controlled thunder, still proving every day that the math dealerships used to justify replacement cycles was more about profit margins than mechanical reality. He didn't think of himself as making a statement anymore. That phase had passed. Now it was just farming, just work. The tractor as familiar to him as his own hands, the quirks and sounds and behaviors all learned and understood. But the statement kept making itself without his effort, because every time someone saw that tractor, every time a farmer calculated what Tom had spent versus what the dealership wanted to charge, every time a young person drowning in equipment debt realized there might be another way, the statement got louder. The village of Millbrook itself changed in small ways that were hard to measure but easy to feel. Conversations at the diner shifted from accepting equipment failures as inevitable to questioning why they happened so often.
The local mechanic Pete started getting calls asking if he could help with older equipment repairs, people pulling tractors out of retirement instead of trading up. The co-op started stocking parts for machines from the 70s and 80s again, simple parts that farmers could install themselves without computer diagnostics or dealer authorization codes. It wasn't a revolution, nothing that dramatic, just a quiet shift in thinking. The kind that happens when someone proves that the way things are isn't the only way things can be. Tom never gave interviews, never went on camera, never wrote articles about what he'd done. When people asked him about it, he'd shrug and say it made sense to him. That was all. And if pressed for wisdom or philosophy, he'd just say that his father taught him to take care of things and they'd take care of you. And that applied to equipment same as anything else. But late one evening in June, sitting on his porch with Linda while the sun set over fields that had been in his family for 3 generations, he said something she'd remember forever. "I didn't do this to prove anyone wrong. I did it because $22,000 for a repair didn't make sense, and spending $100,000 on a new tractor made even less sense when I had something that could work sitting right there in the shed. But what surprised me wasn't that it worked. I knew it would work. What surprised me was how angry it made people that it worked. Like I'd broken some rule nobody wrote down, but everyone was supposed to follow." Linda took his hand, rough and scarred from a lifetime of work that machines were supposed to have eliminated but never did, and asked what he thought the rule was. Tom was quiet for a long moment, watching his tractor parked by the barn. The modern and the ancient merged into something that shouldn't exist but did, and finally said, "The rule is you're supposed to believe that newer is always better, that progress only goes one direction, that the old ways are obsolete, and anyone who questions that is just stubborn or stupid. But sometimes progress is just a word companies use to sell you something you don't need to replace something that still works. Sometimes the old ways are old because they survived when everything else failed. And sometimes the smartest thing you can do is remember that just because everyone's going one direction doesn't mean it's the right one." The Farmall engine was still running 3 years later when this story was last told, still pulling that John Deere frame through seasons and harvests, still proving every day that the quiet confidence of a man who knows what he's doing is worth more than all the sales pitches and corporate promises in the world. Tom Whitaker never became famous, never wanted to be, but in farming communities across the country, his name became shorthand for something important, the idea that you don't have to accept what you're told, that knowledge and skill and patience can solve problems money tries to complicate, and that sometimes the best way forward is to remember what worked before everyone forgot how things used to be built to last.